Please welcome our speaker, Colonel Leighton.
Thanks, Matthew. Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Matthew, for that wonderful introduction. And good morning, everybody. I hope you had a good experience yesterday for those of you who were here, and that you also had a good evening with the social and all of the things that the folks at Secure World have done for us. There are so many things that we can talk about here, but today I wanted to focus on policy issues that really deal with the intelligence realm. And in some ways, I've gotten a lot of free publicity from some folks who have shown up in the news, such as people like Edward Snowden and others who have wanted to reveal a lot about what one of my former employers has done. So let me talk a little bit about how we can actually have a much more effective partnership between the intelligence community and the private sector, but it means that we'll have to shift a lot of paradigms that our society and our government currently operate under. Next slide, please. So here's what I'll look at. We'll look at a little bit at the current threat environment, some of which you know very well. Also look at how other nations do this, how other nations work private-public partnerships, and what those partnerships actually mean for the people there. Take a look at what we're doing in the United States. Good, bad, indifferent, and ugly. And whether or not legislation can fix this. And there's some new developments that I'll talk a little bit about as well in that arena. Then we'll look at how the Intel World's cyber threat information piece, how the Intel community really gathers cyber threat information, how it can help secure the web if it's done correctly. And then looking at a future paradigm for partnerships of this type. So let's look at the current cyber environment. According to Eric Schmidt, 5 billion people will soon be connected to the internet. Now, yesterday, the number that was talked about was 2.5 billion are already connected. So within the next few years, we're going to see a doubling in the number of people around the world who are actually connected in one way or another to the internet. That's a pretty phenomenal development, and it also begs the question, how are we actually going to secure the communications of all of these people? It's one thing if they're all writing letters to each other in the old-fashioned way. It's quite another thing if they're going to be communicating instantaneously to everybody. Daily life, as we know it, really depends on the internet. You do your banking, you get your health care, you work your job, you handle trade issues, you get your education even, all online. So each and every one of those interactions means that the internet becomes the pervasive influence, the pervasive communications tool that we're dealing with. And then you have things like bring your own device. So when you bring your own device, then you're causing security complexities to proliferate. You are doing a lot of different things that make the IT guys in the world go absolutely crazy because they need to change their security protocols, they need to ensure that data can flow from all these different platforms and into different devices. So that becomes a huge, huge deal. Of course, making mobile computing a complete reality for each and every one of us. We all have at least one extra device, and most of us have 2 or 3 extra mobile devices just because we can. But with all of this going on, it has become abundantly clear that the current cyber protective strategies are completely inadequate. And that's not just true for the United States, it's true worldwide. People talk about firewalls being breached, the lack of encryption or the possibility of breaking that encryption, an over-reliance on passwords, and I notice at least one vendor out there talks about how the password is passé, basically, and weak authentication technologies. Even the latest iPhone, the 5S that's come out, apparently a group of German hackers has been able to go after the thumbprint capability, the fingerprint capability for that. And if that's the case, you really have to look at all kinds of authentication technologies and make sure that those technologies are really going to work in a way that we need them to work to provide the security that is necessary for complete commerce to occur on the internet. So the current cyber threat is really based on a multiplicity of factors, but let's get one definition or 2 definitions really out of the way here. Computer network attack is what is often used in NSA and in the intelligence community to talk about actually attacking the network, actually going in there and inserting malware, doing something that actually affects the operation negatively of the network or of a device. Computer network exploitation is basically cyber spying, for lack of a better term. That's when you go in and you actually analyze the network that you're targeting, you take a look at everything that's out there, and you determine where to go next, possibly with the idea of, in the future, launching a computer network attack. So these things are related. There are a lot of cost estimates out there. How much does this actually cost? Some people say it's not so much, some people say it's greater than this. So I'll take a somewhat middle ground and say that within the US, at least $500 billion are spent in one way or another, whether it is actual monetary transactions or the loss of time that is spent mitigating various cyber breaches. On a global scale, that figure is probably very close to $1 trillion annually. There's some pretty good studies in Britain that have taken a look at how much that country spends, and when you start extrapolating based on the number of people that are using the internet in various places and the nature of their networks, this is probably not too far off the mark. There are a lot of different people out there that are causing this kind of havoc. For example, you've all heard of Anonymous and LulzSec. Hacktivists with an agenda, hacktivists with a political purpose, or at least a crowdsourced way of going about their agendas. Those are the kinds of people that do some types of these attacks. Then you have terrorists in cyberspace, and if you think that Al-Qaeda does not use the internet, you're wrong, they do. They're not as sophisticated as some of the other operators out there that I'll talk about in just a bit, but they are a very viable user of the internet, and they send a lot of their messages on the internet. And as a form of communication, they have been able to some extent, use the internet for purposes of contacting their cells, making things happen in that particular sense. State-sponsored cyber attacks get a lot of attention nowadays. And there are several examples that we'll talk about in a little bit greater detail. But suffice it to say, the main oil company, the largest oil company in the world, and the main oil company in Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco, was the victim of a major cyber attack launched from Iran. Nortel, the communications manufacturing company in Canada, basically lost its business and was forced into bankruptcy because Chinese hackers got into the company and caused significant damage over a 10-year period. And banks, subject to a large and concerted effort from a variety of different actors, everything from Russian cyber criminals all the way to state-sponsored actors from Iran and the new Syrian Electronic Army, which, oh, by the way, gets sponsorship from the Iranians. Next slide. Now, there's some reasons why people say we should not partner with the intelligence community, and that would be the primary cause of that. And not necessarily because of what Edward Snowden has said, but more importantly, the things that he has either exposed outright, allegedly exposed, or at least indicated that are things that are capabilities that NSA and its British partner GCHQ have. So everybody is looking at this and they're saying, oh my God, the United States, and to a lesser extent the British, can spy on absolutely everything that we do. Technically, is it possible? To some extent. But remember that intelligence agencies operate under constrained budgets, they operate under constrained time limits, and they also operate, if they're overseen properly, in a way that is very target specific. So that's one side of the effort. On the other side, there are several reasons to look at why there should be a genuine partnership between the intelligence community and private businesses. I talked about the economic costs. $500 billion at least in the United States alone, $1 trillion globally. Then there's the matter of unique sources and insights. Now that is changing a bit because not only does the intelligence community work its sources and its pieces that are out there, but private companies are doing a pretty good job in some sectors of actually developing their own intelligence capabilities. And if they don't have them, they're pretty good at going after and getting folks to work for them who actually have some capabilities. So there is a privatization of the intelligence apparatus right now, in a sense, but if those two are meshed, then the security not only of the country, but also of private industry is enhanced. And that is why you leverage as many unique sources and pieces of insight as you possibly can. And quite frankly, you're already paying for this. Your tax dollars are going to fund these intelligence agencies. These intelligence agencies, whether you realize it or they realize it or not, work for you. And in one effort to demand accountability from them, it becomes very important that you can leverage their expertise to a degree in certain tangible ways. And the other part of this is the speed of cyberspace. We all know how dependent we are on rapid communication nowadays, and as was mentioned yesterday, how disturbing it is for some people to actually receive a phone call. They'd much rather get it in email or a text or something like that. Well, that is all based on very rapid information that you can respond to very quickly, maybe not in a thorough analytical fashion, but you're using that information very quickly. And because of that, the action and the decision cycle when it comes to thwarting cyber attacks is very short and becomes ever more shorter every day. There's kind of a Moore's law and probably even more than that working in the intelligence cycle in the cyber realm. Next slide. Then there's the worsening threat environment. According to the US intelligence community, in their latest threat assessment of the biggest threats against the United States, cyber is the number one, the cyber threat is the number one threat to the United States. It outranks terrorism, it outranks any other type of possible event that could occur in terms of the analysis that's been put together by the intelligence community. Now, they kind of soft-chew this a little bit later in the subsequent sentences in one of their paragraphs where they talk of a remote chance of a cyber attack on the critical infrastructure of the United States in the next 2 years. I would not be, from my personal point of view, I would not be that sanguine about that. I think that there is a very good chance that a critical infrastructure attack could occur. At the very least, I am certain that in the form of computer network exploitation, there are already people out there who have taken a look at elements of our critical infrastructure and have mapped it to the extent that they need to in order to mount an attack should the need arise from a political perspective or from a military operational perspective. Possible targets include things like power grids, the transportation system, banking and finance, as well as healthcare, and of course the energy sector. So when you look at the kinds of attacks that are mounted, everybody talks about DDoS attacks, the distributed denial of service attacks. According to Prolexic, there's been a 718% increase in the bandwidth that is used for these kinds of attacks just in the first quarter of 2013. 718% increase. That's a pretty big increase. And you note now that the average use of the bandwidth that is required to do this actually exceeds by a little bit the capacity that would overwhelm the best systems. So these attacks are getting more pernicious, they're getting bigger, and they're becoming much more of a threat to the daily operation of many companies that are out there. Next slide. So it's not just a technical issue, though, although that is a key element and needs to be worked continuously. There's also the issue of psychological manipulation, and whether it's hackers that are doing this or state actors, there is the psychological impact that a big hacking attack could have not only on the country, but on world commerce and really on our standing throughout the whole world. The consequences of social engineering, especially through hacking, can be very, very considerable. For example, you hack into a Twitter feed. The Syrian Electronic Army hacked into the AP's Twitter feed. Fake story about a White House explosion that you may remember. $136 billion loss in the stock market like that. Now, we were able to regain that through trading and the fact that it was proven false. But that's the kind of thing that can happen if there's any doubt as to the validity of a story, if there's any uncertainty out there, and we all know how much markets hate uncertainty. So these are the kinds of things. They could have tangible economic effects, they could affect pension plans, they could affect all kinds of things that are out there. So it becomes very, very important to look at this from that standpoint. Next slide. Mentioned in the beginning about Saudi Aramco. They lost the use of over 30,000 computer workstations due to a virus known as Shamoon. Shamoon has been traced to Iran, specifically to the cyber army that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has established. And they established that cyber army, by the way, in a very public fashion, which is very interesting. Because usually, when it comes to these kinds of activities, the Iranians and other rivals are very good at putting all this stuff under the table and making sure that people don't know about this. Not in this case. They were very clear not only about the establishment of this unit, but also about some of the strategies that they plan to use against the United States, against Western allies that are in the sanctions regime, engaged in the sanctions regime against the Iranians, and that is a key component to each and every piece of this discussion. I also mentioned Nortel. The intellectual property that Nortel lost is somewhat hard to quantify, but suffice it to say it's in the billions because cyber intruders were resident on Nortel's network for over 10 years. And the company, when they did detect it, they failed to detect it for the first several years. And then when they did detect it, they failed to act. Result, bankruptcy, loss of jobs, and a complete transformation of the telecommunications equipment market so that now companies like Huawei and ZTE and others from China benefit from that. Who's selling to the third world? It's not Nortel. It's Huawei and ZTE. Next slide. So let's take a look at how other nations do some of this. And when you look at this list, you'll note that some of these countries have been pretty vociferous in their complaints about the Snowden affair. Let's start with Britain. So, in Britain, all the key agencies are tied together. They actually have what amounts to a public-private partnership, and they rope in the intelligence community as well. They have this thing called the Office of Cybersecurity and Information Assurance, pretty self-explanatory. Then they have a Cybersecurity Operations Center, which includes the Home Office, which in essence is like the Department of Homeland Security, the Ministry of Defense, I spelled it their way just to be nice, GCHQ, the General Communications Headquarters, which is their signals intelligence outfit, which is like NSA. Then they have their Communications Electronic Security Department, Infrastructure Protection Agencies, the Foreign Office, and the Business Department. Each and every one of these entities has a place at the table, and they very specifically designed this not only to react under normal conditions, but also to react in a crisis situation. Next slide. So let's take a look at Germany. Now, if you had the opportunity to watch German TV after the Snowden affair came to light, you would have thought that the United States was the most evil force on the face of the planet. But what are they doing? In their national strategy on cybersecurity, they say very specifically that cybersecurity is the central challenge for state, business, and society. And when they talk about state, they're talking about everything from the national level all the way down to the local level, the local communal level. They have established minimum standards, something we don't really do with the force of law. They focus on information sharing, which is something that US legislation has tried to do but not succeeded in. Coordination, of course. Civilian efforts are interestingly complemented by none other than the Bundeswehr, which is their armed forces, There's the National Cybersecurity Council, and each of the pieces here, information security, law enforcement, the various police agencies to include their equivalent of the FBI, their disaster response teams, and their intelligence agencies, such as the BND, which is their CIA, are all part of this effort. And every single one of these, to include the academic community, has a seat at the table in Germany. Next slide. In France, again, a complainer, which was interesting because when Le Monde, the French newspaper, published an expose on what the French were doing, it was remarkably similar to what the NSA has been accused of doing. So what do? Well, they have their own Network and Information Security Agency. It's within the Prime Minister's office, and the way the French government works, the Prime Minister is basically the second most important person but runs the day-to-day affairs of the government. Integration of law enforcement, the defense, intelligence, business communities, and they expect something known as common standards of behavior in cyberspace, subject to interpretation, obviously, but basically what they're talking about is preventing cybercrime and also preventing the vociferous hacking of French cyber networks. And if there's ever a crisis, such as war or a major event, the Ministry of Defense then takes over from the Prime Minister's office. Next slide. And Israel has a very interesting situation because not only is it geographically a small country, but it has also been subjected to a whole series, basically 44 million hacking attempts against their government websites that they've been able to defeat. A lot of those come from the Arab world, and there is a huge investment both in the private sector and in the governmental sector in cybersecurity efforts, to include the educational arm. Very strong cooperation between them. All of the various elements are integrated in partnerships, and there's a huge emphasis on cyber education. You can even go online and take Israeli cybersecurity courses, which are actually pretty good. Next slide. Russia, one of our favorite areas. It's better known for its offensive cyber operations. They went after Estonia. How many people are familiar with what happened in Estonia in 2007? Okay, so you know that the banking sector and the governmental sector was basically cut out, all because of a statue from World War II that the Russians didn't want moved. In Georgia, the country, not the Peach State, when the Russians invaded in 2008, they also attacked Georgian websites. Now, many of these attacks were related, or at least attributed to, independent hackers and not the state. However, nothing like this happens in Russia without the approval, or whether tacit or implicit or actual, of the state. And their cyber strategy is designed very specifically to preserve the power of the Russian state. And today, the Russian state means Vladimir Putin. Full integration of all of their capabilities, military intelligence, all of that. That's all part of their effort. Next slide. And then we come to China. There's several elements that have actually been revealed in work that's been done by several private companies. Mandiant revealed the existence of Unit 61398, and Symantec talked about hidden links. Hidden links is a private army of hackers that work in conjunction with a lot of different entities. They're kind of hackers for hire. 61398 is a part of the People's Liberation Army from the Pudong neighborhood of Shanghai. If you go on the web, if you haven't seen it already, you can actually look at the building that they're headquartered in. And basically what all this is these, especially 61398, is targeted very specifically against the English-speaking world, especially the United States. Hidden Links also spends a preponderance of time on the US target. About 52% of its time is spent on the US target, and the rest of the countries, Taiwan is next in the 15 or so percentage area, if I remember correctly. And basically all of this means is that they are engaged in a very concerted offensive cyber strategy. They are using their intelligence apparatus, and if they feel the need to, their military apparatus, in order to engage in a concerted offensive cyber strategy that is designed to extract the maximum amount of information that they possibly can. And if the need arises, if, as we say in the military, the balloon goes up, then they can execute options that would result in actual attacks on US and other networks. So, in the Chinese case, you not only integrate all the other pieces that we talked about in the other countries, but also the party apparatus. And the Chinese Communist Party, in spite of the true semi-capitalist nature of the economy there, is still the leading force of power in China. So what they've done is they've gone after companies like these is not an exclusive list, to steal intellectual property of every type. And if you look at the way in which the latest Chinese fighters are designed, you will see a remarkable similarity to the F-35 and the F-22. And that's not a coincidence, in my opinion. Next slide, please. So in the US, we've got several things that we're doing, and many of you are aware of some of these things. For example, US CERT and related entities from the Department of Homeland Security, basically emergency response for the cyber age designed to do that. It is not, though, it's more of a clearinghouse than an action entity. The President, back in February, issued an executive order that affected all of the governmental departments. And the basic idea here was that it was allowed for standards to be established within the government. It enhanced standards that already existed, but it really didn't take that to the private sector. It encouraged it. It encouraged the development that way, and it has some incentives in it that don't have the force of law. For example, it doesn't contain liability protections, but it is primarily a Department of Homeland Security effort. And the Department of Homeland Security is both in congressional action and in the executive order, in essence, the preferred agency for this kind of activity. And that helps on the law enforcement side, but it doesn't necessarily help with the intelligence side because there is really inadequate crosstalk between all of these entities and the private sector, and the private sector often feels like its views are not being heard in government. So there is a significant amount of work to do on both sides of that. Next slide, please. So will current legislation fix this? Well, not exactly, and here's why. First of all, the act that has had the most prominence in a lot of the discussion is the so-called CISPA, or Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act. CISPA version 1 was last year. Version 2 this year passed the House in April, and by a pretty good margin. It basically comes from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, a bipartisan bill that is designed to provide for information sharing between various entities of the government, especially the intelligence community, and the private sector. The first versions of this bill were intelligence community-centric. The second versions, the later versions, I should say, more in the Department of Homeland Security. The Senate referred to it to its Commerce Committee. No action by the full Senate. Now, having said that, it just so happens that Senator Feinstein from California is in the process of introducing legislation that will be very similar to the CISPA bill. At least that's what the initial reports are. The actual text of that proposal has not really come out yet, but the indications are that there will be some provision for information sharing. So we may start to get on the path of this kind of legislation actually having some traction in the Congress. But one of the key things, of course, especially in the wake of the Snowden issue, privacy concerns, and then liability issues. A lot of the groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and some others are very concerned that if you put liability protections in there, and these liability protections would pertain to companies that share data with the government, and if inadvertently personally identifiable information were to be transmitted to the government, then the liability protection would mean that the company would not be liable for an inadvertent transmission. Electronic Frontier Foundation and others say that's not good enough. No PII no personally identifiable information should be transmitted in these cases. That's an ideal state of affairs. Unfortunately, I don't think that's technically realistic. Current version of CISPA is DHS focused, like I said. Prospects for that piece of legislation are dim. It remains to be seen what will actually happen with the Senate. So let's go to the next slide. So then there's this, the Cybersecurity Act of 2013. Now this came before Senator Feinstein's proposal. Again, reported to the Senate Commerce Committee. This particular version is actually weaker than CISPA. It does, however, call for voluntary cooperation between the public and private sectors, but there's no standards enforcement body, really. There's been no action by either House of Congress, and according to Thomas, which is a website that tracks congressional legislation, the chance of passage is about 36%, slightly above average, but because most bills are 23% or so. But this is obviously not 50-50. So that is one of the major challenges, and Senator Feinstein's efforts may change this dynamic, but as of right now, that's what it is like in the Congress. Next slide, please. So how can, in real life, the intelligence community actually help secure the web? First of all, they have huge threat databases, and they're getting ever larger. Many of you may have seen the report on Fox News that talked about the data facility that's being built in Utah. And it is a huge data facility. It makes every single industrial plant that I've ever been in very small by comparison. That is going to be very interesting to see how these kinds of databases will be leveraged in wake of the concerns about privacy, in wake of all the different particular elements that are out there. But having said that, if you have adequate protections, enforce those protections, train the workforce more than it has been trained in the past, and I can talk about that if you'd like, there are some significant leverage possibilities of the talent that you have there, because you have legions of cyber experts that can be of help. The question is, how do you use them, and how far can you take that partnership? There's some analytical deep dive capabilities that are beyond the capability of many private sector companies. That is changing as we get better at data mining, as we do other things. That equation could change, but I still see the government role as being one of being able to aid more than to hinder if it's done correctly. It's highly developed target knowledge. For example, if you're being attacked by a foreign entity, it helps to know something about that entity, what their modus operandi is, how they came about to do what they do, and what their agenda may be. So that is the key. And the other part of this is that US Cyber Command and NSA have basically been taught over these last few years to focus on actionable intelligence. And if that's done correctly, then the intelligence, with properly vetted people, can actually be used to help secure networks in a fairly real-time fashion. Next slide, please. So, how would you do this? Well, one way to do this is, first of all, you have to reform the security clearance process, as we've seen with the tragic events at the Washington Navy Yard and also with the Snowden effort. But you have to give security clearances to vetted people, even in the private sector and beyond the defense contracting community. You have to ensure, in my view, adequate liability protections, because if you don't have those liability protections and people make an honest mistake, they could be penalized for an honest mistake, and that is wrong. That is not the American way. And then you have to ensure, though, that citizens, by the same token, have privacy protections that they can count on, and that is a huge challenge, but it has to be looked at. But we have to focus on the threat. We have to understand what the threat is. We have to understand how the threat changes and why the threat is doing what it's doing. And key to this is that the information must flow both ways. It cannot be a one-way street. Currently, when there is interaction between the government and the private sector, there are significant complaints that the government is only doing this in a one-way fashion. They don't give, but they take from the private sector. That has to change. The perception has to change, and the reality has to change. Those are key elements of this. And in some cases, it may be because of time constraints, it may be because of technical issues. We should explore the possibility of allowing companies to respond directly to cyber threats. Hack back, in essence. Next slide. I believe that in order to make this all work, we absolutely have to think outside the box. We have to change our government institutions. In some cases, we also have to change private sector institutions. Sclerotic bureaucracies, wherever they are, need to go. They are not part of the cyber age. Have to leverage the knowledge wherever it may be. But when you do that, you also have to remember that with the democratization of cyberspace, there's a responsibility that comes with that democratization. As things are passed out to billions of people, there is a responsibility not only to protect everybody, but you also have to give the people the tools to protect themselves. And that really is what this is all about. Next slide. So we have to keep in mind that the cyber threat is real. The cost of inaction is extremely high. You have to find the knowledge, leverage that knowledge in a way that makes sense and that is legal. You need to fix all of the intelligence oversight issues that were in existence even before Snowden was out there. And we need to take advantage of an opportunity where there's been an unparalleled opportunity to harness these kinds of developments, use the expertise, and leverage it in a way that it benefits the country as a whole. And quite frankly, the time to act is now. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. I think there'll be a microphone coming your way. Yep.
So Mike McAlpin, American Bar Association. You're probably familiar with a study that we helped fund with regard to counterfeit chips, a lot of them coming out of China and so forth. Mm-hmm. I'd be interested in your thoughts there. Also, in discussions with Admiral Fallon and General Hayden in other events like this, we've discussed the overwhelming problems of secure data development and correcting at least the OWASP top 10, if not more. I'm interested in what legislation may be going on to influence that. You know, I've seen, NIST 853 Rev 4 for FISMA. I'm proud to say we're moderate level in that area in my company. But I'd be interested to know how the government is going to incent private industry to do better in those three areas, right. Particularly detecting and replacing, making it cost effective to replace counterfeit chips, for instance.
Right. That's a huge challenge, and I don't think the government right now has an adequate solution to work the counterfeit chip issue. Let me step back a bit, and when it comes to the counterfeit chip issue, that becomes a very big deal. For example, in weapon systems, there are studies out there that you've alluded to that actually show that some of our critical weapon systems, to include latest generation fighter jets and others, may have, in some cases do have, counterfeit chips in them that are made in China. Now, that is a significant issue because each of these weapon systems is extremely computer dependent. This is not like flying a P-51 Mustang back in World War II, which had absolutely no computer capability whatsoever. These instruments of power are completely computerized. And because of that, they are exceptionally vulnerable to these kinds of backdoor possible chips, at least the use of backdoors within chips like this. The counterfeit chips, it may be as simple in some cases as just not functioning from a technical standpoint. In other words, making the aircraft not capable of certain advertised capabilities. But that is probably good enough damage from a saboteur's point of view or a rival's point of view to significantly shift the balance of power from a military perspective. So, for example, the U.S. Strategy, the shift to the so-called shift to the Pacific, was basically designed to showcase maritime and air capabilities in not only the Central Pacific but also the Western Pacific, in case something happens, say in the South China Sea or with Japan or any of a number of other scenarios. If these chips are in there, in these weapon systems, they could potentially be used to render the weapon systems ineffective, potentially destroy the weapon systems in flight. It could, in essence, cause a lot of havoc. Now, to get to the point of actually replacing these, defense contractors have looked at this problem for some time, and there has been some effort to go in and actually replace some of these chips. But in some cases, you don't even know where the supply chain goes. And because the supply chain is so complex for some of these systems, there is a great risk that these kind of counterfeit chips, or even other chips that are not really counterfeit but appear to be counterfeit, which insert backdoors, for example, or something like that, they could be activated in such a way that it could cause significant difficulties. Given that, there are There are still ongoing efforts to replace those chips. There is no congressional legislation that I'm aware of that is going to actually mitigate that problem. So that is something that really needs to be looked at because it goes to a broader issue of supply chain integrity. And supply chain integrity is going to affect everybody. You don't have to be a defense contractor to be affected by that. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Even our critical infrastructure, just power, water, and so forth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had an opportunity to talk to some energy directors from some cooperatives, electric cooperatives around the country. And many of them are completely unaware of the actual cyber threat that is out there. So there's an opportunity there to fix some things. The problem is the legislative requirements, the regulatory requirements that a lot of these companies, some of them very small, have to deal with, do not allow them to efficiently tackle problems like this. And so, the whole business about making things more efficient is as true on the macro scale, which I talked about, as well as on a more detailed, somewhat more tactical level when it comes to fixing the counterfeit chips, because it goes to products, it goes to reputation, it goes to all kinds of efforts like that, but there is no concerted national strategy to fix those things.